Okay, fantastic. We are online. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us again in the FAB Academy Recitations. There has been some confusion today since last week there was the change of time zones in the US, or at least change of the time. The clocks moved a little bit during the last week, and that created some kind of problems with synchronization with the Google settings. I will be sending the link right now for you to join, but I would like to really introduce you. I'm really happy to introduce you Silvia Lindtner, assistant professor at the University of Michigan, right? And I would say like probably the person that knows the most about the maker movement and hacking movement in China, and especially in Shenzhen. Thank you, Silvia, for joining us. You have the FabLab network for you during the next hour, and I hope you enjoyed this lecture as well.
Great, thank you so much, Thomas. I'm really excited to be joining you all today. As Thomas said, I'm currently at the University of Michigan. My name is Silvia Lindtner. Before I started out here in this new job about 1.5 years ago in the School of Information, I actually lived and worked in China for 5 years. So I'm a researcher, to teach things related to do-it-yourself, maker, tinker culture, design practice. And I've been doing research on the topic, as Thomas was saying, in China for many, many years. So I'll be talking about my work in that space today. And I'll just get the slide shares going. Let's see. Great, here they are. Give me 1 second. Okay, so the topic of my presentation today is hacking China, Shenzhen, Shanzhai, and the maker movement. Again, as I said, this is based on research I've been doing in China since roughly 2008. This started out when I was still a doctoral student back at UC Irvine, and then transformed from this early research into a long-term engagement with China. And so when I talk about hacking China, I'll be talking both about the role of making and open source hardware tinkering in China, but also how making and open source hardware and anything around that became really part of a much larger project in China that was about hacking the nation itself and changing the nation itself. So this is what I will be talking about today. So I'll jump right into this. What you see here on the screen is, as many of you, of course, immediately recognize, an Apple iPhone. Even today, the Apple iPhone remains, to many of us, one of the most quintessential examples of contemporary design and innovation. But what very few people knew until more recently, perhaps, is that this phone was made in this particular place. This here is a photo of the city of Shenzhen. It's a 22 million metropolis in the south of China, just 30 minutes by subway from Hong Kong. And in contrast to the iPhone itself, Shenzhen typically carries a much less reputable name. So typically when people think about Shenzhen, if they knew Shenzhen at all, they thought about stories of invisible labor, they thought about Foxconn workers, perhaps even the Foxconn suicides that were in the American news media for quite some time. So this was a story of Shenzhen that really proliferated the media much more so than any other stories. But then more recently, another story about Shenzhen began taking shape. And this is the story of Shenzhen as a Silicon Valley for hardware, or a Hollywood for makers. You see here on the screen a photo of the Shenzhen Maker Fair that took place in June last year, in 2015. It was the second featured maker fair in Shenzhen and was the largest maker fair to date in China. It attracted thousands of entrepreneurs, makers, investors, and educators from all over the world to the city of Shenzhen. So the story here is one of Shenzhen as playing a crucial role in the future of technological innovation. And it's a very different story of the south of China. It's a story of innovation and a story of technological futures. So well-known examples, for example, well-known examples of the innovation capacity of Shenzhen is, for example, this device here. So the Oculus Rift was made and designed by a startup in partnership with manufacturers in Shenzhen. Or another example here, as many of you I'm sure know, the Pebble smartwatch, which was one of these very early sort of quintessential projects in the maker movement that went onto Kickstarter as one of the first open source hardware companies that did that at that time, and raised the single largest Kickstarter campaign in history. And also the Pebble watch, was made and designed in partnership with factories in Shenzhen. So another example of why people know more about Shenzhen today is that in 2012, one of the first hardware incubators set up shop in Shenzhen. Accelerator, now called HEX, was funded by an Irish venture capital firm. And again, very early here, this idea that startups who want to move into hardware need to necessarily partner with manufacturers. So Accelerator basically was one of the first programs that helped startups move into hardware production by partnering them with factories in Shenzhen. So, here we, this is another photo of an earlier maker fair in Shenzhen. Again, it's a very different sort of image of the city as these earlier stories about cheap labor and manufacturing and so on, right? So we really see a very different image of Shenzhen that has emerged over the years. This here is the quote by Dale Doherty, who I interviewed when he visited for the first time, when he visited Shenzhen for the first time in April 2014. And I think it's a really telling quote of why so many people come to Shenzhen today, especially people in the maker movement and people who want to start hardware businesses. So he says here, if you're in Detroit, it's really difficult to get things made because the big car manufacturers and other manufacturers don't really want to talk to you. He says, when I started Maker Fair in Detroit, I had people come up to me, makers come up to me who said, I live in the manufacturing capital of America, but I can't get things made. And he then continues by saying, Shenzhen is different. It represents a place where they still make lots of things. That expertise is concentrated and detailed there, not only sourcing parts, but people who know what they're doing. And yet another example, this is from a quote from Choi Itu, the head of the MIT Media Lab. After a visit to Shenzhen, he says, local factories there are willing and able to design and try all kinds of new processes to produce things that have never been manufactured before. So what we see here, in sort of startups who have come to Shenzhen since roughly 2011, 2012, now educational programs like the MIT Media Lab, Dale Doherty, Make Media, many different people are now coming to Shenzhen. The story of Shenzhen is really a very different one than how we used to think about manufacturing in China before. So here, Shenzhen is rendered as carrying a lot of potential for the future of technological growth and scientific expertise, and in particular, Shenzhen playing a crucial role for the maker movement itself. So what I want to sort of show you in the rest of my talk today is that both of these stories, though, so the old story of Shenzhen as being, a place where there's low quality work happening, cheap labor, and on the one hand, right, and then the other story of Shenzhen as this rising innovation hub, both of these stories are very simple and are too simple, I argue. So both cities, for example, both stories of the city portray Shenzhen only in its relationship to the West, right? So on the one hand, there's the story of foreign companies coming to Shenzhen to manufacture, and in particular Western companies like Apple, for example. And on the other hand is the story of Shenzhen now also functioning like a Silicon Valley. And I would say that both of these stories in portraying Shenzhen simply in relationship to the West is a too simple story. And so I want to give you a glimpse today into what is left out in both of these binary sort of views of Shenzhen. And I want to share in particular with you who else makes Shenzhen today. So who was basically central to the transition of Shenzhen being known as simply a place for low quality production to a place where innovation is happening today. So this is just sort of a one-sentence statement of what I will be showing you today in this talk, is that the making of Shenzhen as this new kind of place is really unfolding through a variety of things. So it unfolds through the making of things and products, but also through urban redesign and through individual life stories and careers. So people who come to Shenzhen, they make the city and they change the city by making their own careers and making their own life stories. And all of that together, you know, I'll show you today is a collective project on changing China itself. So as I said earlier, most of this research, you know, comes out of a year-long engagement with China. So I conduct mostly ethnographic research. I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with that term, ethnographic research. Ethnographic research basically comes out of anthropology, and it means that you spend long periods of time with people on the ground, interviewing them, observing what they do, but also fundamentally participating in what they're doing. So my ethnographic research then meant that I spent many months and years in maker spaces in China, tinkering and working on prototyping. And then that research eventually also took me to Shenzhen and working with hardware startups. So on the lower right of the screen here, you see a photo of the startups that had joined the Accelerator Incubator program in 2013. And you might see me here as part of the photo on the right side. So I was an embedded ethnographer. I researched basically how did these startups move from an idea into production within only a couple of months. And then part of the research, you know, is, you know, me joining people while they are moving into production, basically looking at what they are doing. And throughout this work, I've been doing not only participant observation, but I've also started to collaborate with two very good friends of mine, Anna Greenspan from NYU Shanghai and David Lee, who is the co-founder of China's first hackerspace. So in 2011, we started a research collective called Hacked Matter. And what we ended up doing there was basically organizing a series of conferences and panels to bring together people who were passionate about making and hacking and production in one way or the other. So at that time, making was still fairly new to a lot of people. So when you talk, you know, when you ask somebody, have you been to a makerspace, or have you been to a hackerspace, or have you been, you know, to a fab lab, many people would say, oh, what is that, you know? So it was still a fairly fresh topic. And so our goal with, you know, bringing people from all over the world to China was to understand what is happening in this very unique moment in China as making is proliferating also in China, and as China is becoming, and the south of China in particular, is coming to play such a big role for the maker movement. So you see here, for example, photos of events that we did both in Shanghai and in Shenzhen. And also, for example, there's, you know, people here participating from India, from the UK, from America, from Italy. Massimo Banzi here participated in one of our programs, as the Zach from MakerBot at that time, and Anil Menon, who is a science fiction writer. So we really tried to bring people together active in the research, maker, entrepreneurship community who all care in one way or the other about making. And part of these events were also hands-on making and fabrication to understand you know, what was going on in making through a hands-on engagement. So you could call this a kind of critical making approach or a research through making approach, where we argue that, you know, one important way to understand contemporary social phenomena and political and cultural phenomena is by making and through making itself. And I'm happy to talk about this in the Q&A later if you guys are interested in that particular research approach that we've been developing at Hacked Matter. Okay, so this was a little bit about how did I do this research. So I now want to go back into the actual research itself and my findings. So this here on the screen is Eric Pan, and I know that Eric Pan has actually given a lecture just very recently for you all. So you're already very familiar with his work. But just to give you a little bit background of how important Eric Pan actually was for the maker movement in China and for connecting China to makers elsewhere, I want to just give you a little bit of a glimpse into how he started this work. So this is a photo of Eric Pan when he just started out his work at Seed Studio. So he co-founded Seed Studio when he was 26 years old. He quit his job as an electrical engineer at Intel at that time. And Seed Studio in some ways then is, kind of a typical example of a successful startup. So they started working at, in a garage in Shenzhen, and basically began by, designing open source hardware platforms that built on the Arduino. So Eric had this idea, well, I'm here in China and the maker movement is expanding and people are very excited about it and I'm excited about it, but I'm sitting here in China and there's actually so much professional making happening. So what if I brought the expertise of making and professional production here in China to the maker movement? And that was sort of what motivated the early start of Seed Studio. And then Seed Studio was so successful in this that it grew within only 2 years into a $10 million company. And today has over 400 employees. So this fairly small startup that grew out of Shenzhen in the south of China, moved very, very quickly through this vision of bringing together manufacturing in China and the maker movement. So to just give you an example of what that meant practically in terms of the artifacts and products that Seed Studio produced. So you see here on the right side, the Seeduino, on the left side, the Arduino Uno. The Seeduino was one of the first products that came out of Seed Studio, and it built on the Arduino, but was able to actually improve the capacity of the board itself, but was offered at a lower price. So the Seeduino right away took advantage of Seed Studio being tapped into the manufacturing culture and ecosystem in Shenzhen to basically offer an improvement in the quality of the hardware and the open microcontroller platform itself. So this was one of the earliest products, and some of you might actually know this platform very well and might have worked with it. So fast forward, this here is a photo of one of Seed Studio's most recent products. This is the RePhone, which some of you might have seen as well. The RePhone is an open source phone kit that's comprising modules of bundled functionality that can be plugged together to assemble a phone of your liking. So for instance, you could make a phone with 2 SIM cards, or a phone with 3 cameras, or a phone with a motion sensor, or a phone that looks and is shaped in a way that you like. So when you go on the Kickstarter site for the RePhone, this is what Seed Studio says in the video. It says, what if we designed a phone to be anything we want to be? For the last 8 years in Shenzhen, Seed Studio has been busy hacking the electronic supply chain to make advanced tools and technologies available to everyone. The result is the RePhone. So you might then ask, what does it mean to hack the electronic supply chain of one of the world's largest manufacturing hubs in the world? And how is it possible for a relatively small company like Seed Studio to do this? And what motivated them to do so in the first place? So in order to explain what motivated them so in the first place, I'm going to show you this. So this is the label that is on all of the Seed Studio products. And it reads, innovate with China. So this is just, an LED in this case, but this is written, innovate with China is written on all of Seed Studio's product labels. And I want to highlight this here because this tagline is very different from the more traditional tagline that we see on products that are made in China, where it says literally made in China, right? So Eric Pan explained this to me. When I interviewed him a couple of years ago, he said, well, when I came to the United States in 2010, people there knew us and liked our products, but nobody wanted to believe that we are a Chinese company. Nobody had thought that cool and innovative products could come out of China. That's why ever since we have been using innovate with China on our product labels to demonstrate that manufacturing in China can mean partnership and innovation instead of cheap labor and low quality. So I want to highlight this because Seed Studio's vision behind bringing together manufacturing and the maker movement was really also to demonstrate that Shenzhen and manufacturing in China can mean something else than what we typically think of when we think about manufacturing, which is this notion that design happens elsewhere, and then people don't partner but simply send their design files to a factory in the south of China or elsewhere, right? And then it's simply executed. So the vision, the sort of notion of innovate with China points to the ways in which what happens in practice between manufacturing and design is a form of partnership. And Seed Studio has been very influential in making that visible to particularly a Western audience. So this is another product and artifact that Seed Studio has produced in partnership with Chaikhor, the local hackerspace in Shenzhen. So this is the Shenzhen map for makers that came out very early, that basically makes visible to startups and makers and designers and everyone else who comes to Shenzhen to understand its manufacturing ecosystem by mapping out the different resources of small to large scale manufacturers, the downtown electronic markets in the city called Huatiangbei. So Huatiangbei is a particularly important part of the city for many makers when they come to Shenzhen for the first time. So many makers who come, the first place they go to is the downtown market, because it gives people an immediate sort of access and understanding of the scale of production in Shenzhen. So what you can see here on the right is sort of that Shenzhen basically is just north of Hong Kong, and it stretches sort of alongside the coast. But then there's like a zoomed in loop that is then magnified on the left side of the screen. And you can see here basically a 15 by 15 city block area, which is the downtown electronic markets of Shenzhen called Huatiangbei. And this area in turn is filled with department store-like buildings, which are in turn, filled with floors and floors of vendors, electronic producers, people who recycle electronic components and offer them for purchase. So anything from the tiniest component to a finished product you can find in Huatiangbei. And so here, for example, is a photo of Zach, who is one of the co-founders of MakeupBot, which many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with. And he stands here in the downtown markets of Huatiangbei. And, this is one of his quotes. When he describes the relevance of Huatiangbei, he says, well, Shenzhen is like living in a city-sized tech shop. So this is sort of this notion that, manufacturing and production is ready at your hands. You just go into the markets, you can get a feel for how manufacturing works and the products and the components that are being used, but just going into these markets. So I want to show you now a couple of images though of what has changed in these markets ever since more and more makers and entrepreneurs and investors have come to Shenzhen. So on the left side here, you see a photo of the markets, how they looked like just about a year ago. And on the right side, you see a photo of how the markets have been redesigned now. So, you can clearly see a different kind of aesthetic. They're much cleaner and somewhat glossier. Here's another photo of a stall in the markets from a year ago. And this is how this looks like today. So pretty much, the same practice is happening in the markets, but there's an upgrading happening of the markets itself. And this, I want to argue, is something that you've seen in Shenzhen more broadly over the last 5 years. So with the increasing international attention, the city itself has been transformed and is trying to remake itself into, visibly an innovation hub. So this here is a photo of the SEG market. The SEG market is one of the earliest electronic markets in Huatiangbei, in this downtown region of Shenzhen. And it's in that sense because it was one of the earliest markets, one of the most important ones until today. So just outside of the SEG market today, you see the following sign. It's a large concrete sign that reads in both English and Chinese, Shenzhen, Huatiangbei, cradle for entrepreneurs, paradise for starting a business. And so I want to highlight here, I'm not sure if there's anyone in the audience who can read Chinese, but I want to highlight here actually that the Chinese term for maker, you will see right in the middle basically of the screen. So the Chinese term for maker, 创客, here has been translated into English as entrepreneur. And so I want to highlight this here because, when China's first hackerspaces opened in 2010, this was also the time when China's makers, so people like Eric, and people like David Lee and Justin Wong and other people who basically started, these small companies and small businesses and small, maker spaces. When they started out, it was really kind of a grassroots movement. These people then also, these makers also came up with the term 创客. So they were like, we need to give what we do a name in Chinese, right? And the name for maker that they came up with was 创客. 创客kind of translates into what you might say a kind of creative professional, a tinkerer. And so what I want to highlight here is though that now, with an increasing sort of endorsement of making across regions, you also see this of course in the United States, but also in China, making now is seen as a form of entrepreneurship, is seen as something that that enables people not only to tinker and play, but also to start new businesses and to drive innovation, especially in a city like Shenzhen, for example. So this is a screenshot here of a recent government initiative that came out of China very recently. So the Chinese Prime Minister Li Keqiang visited the Shenzhen-based hackerspace Chaihuo in 2015 and was very excited about what he saw in the local hackerspace, and then went back to Beijing and very briefly later, very shortly thereafter, announced a new policy that would translate into English as something like the mass makerspace or makerspace for the masses and mass innovation. And this is just yet another example of how, governments across regions have become very, very excited about making, to think about how making can enable the local economy to thrive in new ways, can give people new forms of employment. So again, many of you I'm sure are familiar with, how this is happening across regions and in your own localities, but making is definitely something that companies and governments across regions have been excited about. So, coming back here to this particular place in the downtown area of Shenzhen where the electronic markets are. So I showed you earlier here this concrete sign that's right outside of the SAG market, this very important electronic market. But then when you go to the 12th floor of the electronic market, there's now also a maker space. So again, it's, what used to be, sort of somewhat chaotic stalls of people selling and trading components and devices, now also has a maker space, with the vision to bring in entrepreneurs and tinkerers and students by learning and tapping right into Shenzhen's infrastructure of production, but by also providing a space for exploring and prototyping. And I want to, I introduced you to Eric before, and Eric, again, is one of these key figures who has really played a central role in shaping Shenzhen into what it is today. This is another important person in this space. This is Shirley Fung, who has been living in Shenzhen for a long time. She actually first came in her 20s to Shenzhen, when Shenzhen wasn't really a big city yet, and started working in the industry, in the manufacturing industry, which at that time was mostly in the Huaqiang Bay area, and basically started by working in a call center and then slowly working her way up, becoming a partner in several manufacturing businesses. And today Shenzhen is really her home, and also that of her family. And she then, in around 2008, became the director of the Shenzhen Industrial Design Association that she helped start. And I want to highlight the year when she started this. So this was in 2008. So this was before Shenzhen has been on the periphery of, of many people's understanding of making. So she started this in 2008, and the Shenzhen Industrial Design Association, under her leadership, has ever since, hosted a series of design fairs. And I'm showing here a picture of one of the more recent industrial design fairs that the team organized. And here's some photos. So you see Seed Studio here and Maker Block are actually also represented here. But traditionally, the Industrial Design Fair was really about showcasing industrial designers and their products that had come out of Shenzhen already very early on. So Shenzhen was already doing for a long time design work, but very few people actually knew about that in the broader sort of IT, especially in the Western IT industry. So what I'm arguing for here, what I want to show you here is basically that through the hosting of these events and the work that Shirley and Eric have been doing since roughly 2008, this all has been important work to make Shenzhen into what it is known today for so many makers who come today. So it was really, this is another example of an event that Shirley's group hosted, which is again about designing and thinking how designing can also, enable a particular kind of future for China and the world writ large. So all of these events, from the early industrial design fairs all the way to the Maker Faire that I've talked about earlier, the Maker Faire in Shenzhen, all of this has shaped the city through the work that people like Shirley and Eric and many others have been doing on the ground on a daily basis. So I just wanted to show you a couple of more photos of the district of the city where the Shenzhen Maker Faire took place. So this is in the west-south part of the city. So it's about half an hour subway ride from the Huaqiangbei electronic markets. And this is a very new district. So the Maker Faire, in a way, was the first event that helped give this particular district kind of livelihood and a new spirit. So you can see here, it's very modern-looking buildings, sort of that that are sort of in this image here. And for those of you who can read Chinese, this is one of the parks here that is meant specifically for people who want to start up businesses. This is a photo of the apartment buildings that are right next door. So the Maker Faire, the hosting and the work that went into making the event of the Maker Faire itself has also helped rejuvenate and basically make a whole new part of the city. So I just want to emphasize the scale of this. This part of the city did not exist beforehand. It's a completely new part of the city. And so for those of you who might not be as familiar with Shenzhen, I just wanted to give you a little bit of a historical view on the city, just to give you a sense of how young the city is. So the city, the region around Shenzhen in Guangdong, south of China, was declared a special economic zone in 1979. And this was part of China's opening reforms under Deng Xiaoping. So the goal at that time was really to say, as China is opening towards the world, what is China's version going to be of economic reform and economic growth? And the goal with establishing special economic zones was to give incentives for foreigners to invest in these particular regions. And so what happened in Shenzhen was that it coincided with the Western outsourcing boom. So this was with, when Western IT companies in Europe and the United States basically moved production sites elsewhere. Shenzhen was one of these particularly attractive regions. And so what happened over the following 10 years was an expansion of production in the south of China, particularly the rise of contract manufacturing and original design manufacturing. And again, Foxconn, which produces for Apple, is one of the most well-known examples of this. But what really happened was that within only 30 years, the city grew from a region that was focusing on agriculture and fishing into a large international metropolis of production, trading, and design practice. And so I'm just saying this because very few people actually know some of the history that's tied into the city, and very few people also know about a very unique manufacturing culture that took rise alongside the large contract manufacturers like Foxconn. And so I want to talk a little bit about that in the remainder of this presentation now. So what you see here on the next screen are photos of products that came out of Hong Kong factories in the 1960s, 70s, and later. So these are products that were produced by family-owned businesses. Most of them copycat kind of productions of well-known brands, like the copycat Gucci bag or the copycat Nike or Adidas and so on. And this was retail basically, and was meant designed for people who could not actually afford the actual brand, which is very expensive, right? So this was designed, these products were kind of designed for, let's say, for lower income populations. So this had started out in Hong Kong in the 1950s and 60s, as I said, through small-scale family-run factories. This had later then moved to Shenzhen as electronics manufacturing took rise in Shenzhen. And so the small businesses moved up north and scaled in size and started not just making retail, but also electronic products, again, for markets and for people who could not afford a branded phone like the Apple iPhone, for example. And in 2008, there basically was a Chinese term that was applied to describe this new phenomenon. So the term that I'm talking about here is Shanzhai. So I'm not sure how many of you have heard about Shanzhai before, but you might wonder, why was this term used to describe this kind of small scale production practice that started out in the south of China? So Shanzhai basically refers to a folklore story in China of about 108 rebels, and you see them depicted here on the screen, hiding in the mountains, and so the notion was that these 108 rebels would take from the rich and then give it to the poor. So they would take from the emperor and then give what they took from the emperor to the poor. So this is kind of like, in the West, we would say like a Robin Hood story. So it's kind of like outlaws who have gone away to the mountains, doing things within their own rules. There's an element of criminality about Shanzhai, just the way Robin Hood is a bit of an outlaw. But it's really sort of this notion of autonomy, independence, and very progressive survival techniques that Shanzhai came to stand for. And so this term was applied to speak to this production that took rise in Shenzhen of mobile phone, very creative versions of mobile phone production. So you can see here on the screen phones that are shaped like a car, or a phone that looks like a cigarette box, phones that were designed for specific niche markets that weren't tapped by large multinational corporations like Nokia or Apple at that time. And so here you see some of these more recent phones that I found in the electronic Huaqiangbei market in Shenzhen. So on the right side, you see a phone that is also a flashlight and a radio. On the left side, you see a phone that's shaped like an alcohol bottle, or like a cute little bunny, which is a comic figure in China. And here, this is one of my favorite ones, a phone that's shaped like an apple. And so in my research, I was very curious to understand, how does this work? So basically what has happened over the years is that this Shanzhai production, so this kind of creative repurposing of existing brands, utilizing old and discarded parts and putting them into these new creations and phones, I was curious, how does it work, and who makes this and why, and how is it actually possible to make so many different devices shaped in very unique ways? And so what I found over the years in this research is that fundamental to this manufacturing culture that emerged sort of in the shadows of the more official contract manufacturing culture in Shenzhen is an informal system of open sharing that you could compare in some ways to the open source hardware maker community that many of you are very familiar with. So let me explain. So what you see here on the screen is a reference board that goes into producing a smartwatch. And this reference board is called Gongban in Chinese. And it's basically an open source board. So it's shared within a network of factories, thousands of factories in the south of China. All the bill of materials, every tiny little component and how it functions together on this board is openly shared. And so this allows people to basically take one board and then attach a different casing to it, make a different phone, or make a slight modification on the board and create a completely different device with different functionality. So what this has allowed people to do in the south of China through this informal sharing economy that you could compare to like an open source Arduino kind of board, right, is to iterate very quickly, make tiny modifications, and bring products to the market really fast. So by openly sharing these resources, companies in the south of China now can move from idea into production within roughly sort of 30 days. It really depends, of course, on the complexity of the product, but if you really just change, modify slightly, you can bring things to the market fast. Now, so some of you might think, well, this is all great, but what does this have to do with, sort of the scale of Shenzhen today? So I want to show you a little bit of like how big of an industry this has become. So some of you might be familiar with this Chinese phone brand called Xiaomi. So Xiaomi has its historical roots in Shanzhai production. So it grew out of the open sharing Gongban tradition and is now one of the most well-known Chinese phone brands with international reputation. There was just a recent Wired article on Xiaomi as well. And it's basically became so popular in China because it was a smartphone. It was affordable. So it was a smartphone designed for migrant workers, for people who could not otherwise afford a smartphone. So it was one of the very early affordable smartphones. And just to give you another sense of the scale of it, so a lot of these products, that are coming out of Shenzhen are now being shipped to India, to Africa, to Latin America. It's actually, it's a huge business, multi-million dollars of revenue. And this is just another example of a phone, Techno-Mobile, that's designed specifically for the African market. So this is just to give you a little bit of a sense of how, it's a story of globality that doesn't quite fit with the sort of typical story we think about global innovation that's maybe perhaps between Silicon Valley and New York and Shenzhen and Barcelona, right? It's a very different story of global reach that extends into niche markets in other parts of the world, like Latin America and Africa and so on. So I want to leave you just with a couple of concluding remarks now. So, we might want to think then, why, for example, the Arduino board here on the left side is, that is typically rendered as the sort of quintessential example of open source, the maker movement. It's considered very innovative. And on the right side here, I put this, the photo of the Gongban, of the open reference board that's used in Shenzhen. So typically, we have talked about the one on the right side as something that stands for copycat, that's bad, that's cheap, that's low quality. But what I've presented you, what I've shown you today is really challenging, that the one on the right stands for low quality and bad and copy, and the left one stands for innovation. What I want to show you is that both of them embody open source and innovation, but just in very different ways, right? So the left grew out of a history of design culture in Italy, and the right one grew out of a history of manufacturing and making do in China, but both share a kind of open source spirit, but yet in very different ways. And then we also might think, why do we, sort of to challenge sort of this typical notion of what counts as design and innovation. On the left side, the iPhone, again, which, I started this talk with, stands for this quintessential example of innovation. And on the right side is the Techno phone that's, designed specifically for African market, but we rarely think of that phone in terms of innovation and design. So all of what I've shown you today, from Eric's work, at Seed Studio, the makers who come to Shenzhen, the remake of Shenzhen, the change of Shenzhen, all of that is challenging in many ways how we typically think of design and manufacturing and innovation. So when you look at the back of your iPhone, it says designed by Apple in California and assembled in China. So what we see here is an inherent bias that's reflective of a much more widespread conception of technological production that splits manufacturing and design along geographical lines. So technology is conceived and designed in the West, designed by Apple in California, and then outsourced for manufacturing to low-wage regions with loose regulatory environments. And so designers here understood as the agents, with their ideas being executed elsewhere, somewhere in the so-called developing world. And so what I've shown you today, all the way from Innovate with China, the Huajiangbei markets, the Gongban open source electronic boards, all of that challenges this very simple and binary notion of that somewhere in the West design is happening and somewhere in the so-called developing world, people are just executing it. And with this, I would like to thank you so much for your attention, and I'm super happy to take questions about anything that I talked today. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Silvia. It was fantastic. I keep learning about China through your work, and it's just impressive to see how it grew over time. And it makes me think about a great project that put you in somehow in a different perspective. So, what is your thinking on this culture in China happening elsewhere? So when you work in Shenzhen, you look to the city through the eyes of a researcher. You have been doing it for more than 5 years now. When you look in a European city, what do you see in comparison to what is happening in China? In relationship with this ideal moment in which and it's something that we are working with in the Fab Labs in bringing manufacturing back to the city. How culturally you see that happening in different contexts? No? I mean, how you see how the other cities look through your eyes after being doing all this work in Shenzhen?
Yeah, I think that's a really important question, because what I've been trying to also show you today is really how much, when we talk about making, right, is so culturally, historically specific, right? So it's, on the one hand, there is people who come together because they're passionate about making, and that brings a lot of us together across regions, and that's really powerful. But on the other hand, I think it's really important to pay specific attention to what is unique in a given city or site, right? And to really understand, what has led to a particular version of making in that particular place. So rather than saying making should mean the same anywhere, right? It's really exciting to think about, what does making in Barcelona mean? What does it mean in Shenzhen? What does it mean in New York, and so on, right? And so in part of what you've also seen over the years, is that a particularly American story of making has begun proliferating, which is sort of this notion, and again, I'm in the US right now, so I hear that story a lot, right? Which is the story of, we have lost manufacturing due to outsourcing, and we want to bring it back, right? So a lot of people here in the United States, and the Obama administration has been sponsoring that as well, this idea that by hosting maker fairs and supporting people doing all kinds of maker projects, we can bring back Made in America, right? And that story is, on the one hand, a fantastic one, because it has moved funding, it has enabled people to move, and set up new businesses and fab labs and maker spaces and so on. But on the other hand, it's only one story of making. It doesn't really, that story doesn't really work for China, because manufacturing is still there. There is no need to bring back made in China, right? Because made in China is still happening. And so again, I think it's important to move beyond these sort of like single stories of making, right? And really look at what is unique in a particular city. And I know, just from you, how much there's going on in Barcelona, for example, right? That's specifically unique to sort of the political and social context in Barcelona, right? So I think there's a lot of opportunity in saying, what can we do by partnering then across these regions, right? To say what is unique in Barcelona can then be tied together with, what people are doing in another part of the world, So I think I was just in New York actually for a conference this week, and went to Industry City, which is a new sort of part of the city that, which basically has turned old factories into new sites of production and innovation. And again, it's this notion of, oh, this was a place of production, but what if we brought it back today? And I know that there's a lot of conflicting stories about Industry City, because the big question is that only a space where fairly affluent people can go, right? Or is it also a place where people who do craftsmanship and production in the US today can also go? So I think that is a big challenge as we move ahead, to recognize these existing cultures of making and manufacturing that maybe don't look as cool as those that are happening in a maker space, right? But how could we bring together, these diverse cultures and practices of making?
Okay. I had a small drop in my okay. So I have another question which is related to something that we have been reflecting and also working within the Fab Labs. It's understanding in the roadmap that in some point these places where you can make things will help you to make things that make the things, right? So it's not only making for the sake of making, but actually it's making tools, making things that actually allow you to go beyond just to replicate existing objects in the world or mixing them, but actually creating new things. This is the idea of the Fab Lab tools here. And envisioning that, we said, I like to say a different thing. Like, it's not only like designing China or innovating China, but also China, from being a factory of products, could be a factory of factories. It could be a strategy to deploy manufacturing tools in cities. Do you think that that's an approach that could happen? So China can provide the tools for manufacturing if needed, or what do you think about it? What do you think about it?
I mean, I think it's a really intriguing idea, especially when we talk about scale, because I think there seems to be multiple versions that circulate with regards to how people envision the future of making, right? Some people say it should be about small scale craftsmanship, sort of local kind of fine-grained production. And then there's also the vision of what would it mean to sustain this and scale it up, perhaps, So I think the challenge perhaps for a vision like, factories that build factories and so, is that, Shenzhen and China itself is changing. And so in part of, the story that I told you today is kind of also a story about desire and hope for alternative futures in China. So, the Chinese government has long been sort of trying to revamp its image, from a place that stands only for made in China towards an image for created in China, right? And so what you see happening already is that manufacturing in Shenzhen is in part also moving elsewhere. So while the headquarters are still in Shenzhen, there's also, so what started in already the 90s was that manufacturing moved from downtown Shenzhen to the rural parts in the outskirts of the Guangdong region. So when you're in Shenzhen, you actually always have to drive some time to get to a factory, right? Because the factory is in Guangdong. And then what happened is that factories also moved into other parts of China, particularly the West, because labor was still cheaper there. And now, wages are rising in Shenzhen. Real estate is really expensive in Shenzhen. So again, Shenzhen is remaking itself as China is remaking itself, right? And as all of that is happening, manufacturing is also already moving from Shenzhen into other parts of India and Africa. And so I think the crux maybe for this vision of, factories that make factories is to sort of see what is already happening in this space and, what kind of partnerships is China already entering that's actually, again, with regions we typically don't think about when we sit in Europe or the United States, right? So again, this is, Africa, India, and so on. So I think that's something we need to pay attention to, and then also look at the politics of kind of the regional politics, right? What does it mean, again, for a region in Europe to upgrade manufacturing? And that's a big thing in Europe, right? Through the Industry 4.0 initiative, right? And you see the same happening in China with upgrading manufacturing, right? And you see the same in the United States too. So I think we need to pay attention to sort of these multiple levels of what is already happening with regards to upgrading and changing existing workplaces, right? And then tap into that, so to say.
I have another question which is related, and probably we have this and one last one. It's about what have you seen in relationship, which practices have you seen in Shenzhen and the different manufacturing scales that you can see in the city in relation to kind of a circular economy approach, in the being worried about supply chains, about waste disposal, reuse. Do you think China is moving in that direction, is starting to move there, or what have you observed during this time?
Right. So I mean, that's why I brought up Shanzhai in part as well. I was hoping somebody would ask that question because Shanzhai itself is, I think, at the moment still offers an alternative rather than China now outsourcing to Africa. I think it does offer an alternative. So when you look at Shanzhai, how it has worked in part is through a complex recycling infrastructure. So when you go to the Huaqiangbei markets, you find components that are recycled from discarded products that are being fed into the Shanzhai production ecosystem. So you can buy components, that are still working, and people are using them for the making of new kinds of devices. So there's kind of this built-in, circular economy kind of infrastructure, but it's an informal economy, right? So Shanzhai is super informal. The government does not recognize it. The government, in fact, actually wants to dismantle a lot of it because, again, Shanzhai has this notion, especially when it has connotations of copycat, of backwards, So the government in particular doesn't look at it as something that looks as shiny and cool as Silicon Valley startup venture capital sort of models of innovation, right? And so I think, there is a real opportunity to actually look at what is working well about this current reuse open sharing kind of production culture in Shanzhai before it is dismantled, before it is, made sort of less relevant. So I think that would be, if you talk about intervention, that would be something, that I'm hoping to do with my own research, to sort of point out to this potential for an alternative that I see in Shanzhai without idealizing it. I mean, Shanzhai is not all great. I mean, it's a very masculine industry, similar to the IT industry elsewhere, So I'm not romanticizing it, but I'm trying to point to see what is an opportunity in there, right? And I think in part, while the upgrading of Shenzhen is wonderful, and on the one hand, because it gives opportunities to companies like Seed Studio, it also devalues an existing culture of design and production that has grown out of the last 30 years through these very informal practices of people who didn't come from wealthy family backgrounds, right? Who really worked their way up. And so I think that is a really amazing opportunity that I'm hoping at one point the government and other important people are trying to pay attention to.
Okay, one last one, Silvia. In this process of that happens already, like in between the manufacturers of mobile phones, that this kind of informal open sourcing of the design files, even software, the schematics of the circuits, how that happens? Is legal? Is like someone leaks some information? How this in the spread? How detailed have you seen of this phenomenon?
Yeah, so just sort of like practically how it works. So I've showed you this reference board, right? So there's companies, design solution houses in Shenzhen who make these boards, and they're quite legitimate in that sense. They partner with international companies like Intel, for example, and they don't sell their boards because what these companies sell are the components themselves. So they make money by selling the components, and so they create these reference boards to show other companies in the market, right, other manufacturing units in Shenzhen, how they could, for example, pair an Intel chip with other components, or pair a rock, an all-winner rock chip, infrastructure of chip technology with other components, right? So they give these out and share the bill of materials. So these are documents, physical documents, and in part also online, for people to see, okay, what could I build with this? What could I make with that, right? And so the process itself, is part actually of an international industry. So, Intel's tablet market, in part depends actually on these reference boards in China. But at the same time, it's also very often thought of as a half gray market, right? Because there is a lot of them just building on top of each other. Like I showed you these little phones, like the phone that looks like an apple, these more humorous creations, right? These come out in sort of, these are like experiments, you might say, where, sort of a design solution house is testing a new design and just throws 4,000 pieces on the market, right? And then another company in Shenzhen, notices, oh, that actually sold really well. So let me make one that maybe looks the same but has a different color or something, right? So you see this constant, what we call in the West open source, by slight modifying and tweaking something, is very often also called, well, that's copy, right? And that's why it's in part also this gray zone, right, where people are, taking things, that they see in the market and build on top of it and copy it and remake it. And so it's this really interesting in-between zone that's actually very much part of the established tech industry. So it's kind of, the informal economy that feeds right into it and that sustains it. And on the other hand, that informalness also, makes it subject to attack that it's copycat.
Okay, thank you very much. As you know, this summer, we are having the International Fab Lab Conference in Shenzhen. So many things I have to learn in order to prepare for that week. It's from the 8th to the 14th of August. I don't know if you will be there, and if not,
I'll try to be there. Yes. Let's
try to make you be there. I also think that it will be nice to work together in preparation to the conference. I will forward you an email together with Sherry. I think that's gonna be really, really interesting. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for sharing with the Fab Lab Network. This video is gonna be available online. It's freely available for everyone. And yeah, I have to say just thank you. It was great.
Thank you so much, Thomas. This was really wonderful, and yeah, I look forward to working together for August, and very excited to see you all back in Shenzhen. And thank you so much for making the time today and inviting me to give this talk.
Thank you. Okay. Bye bye. Bye bye, rest of the world. See you next week.
Bye.
Ciao.